Ridgefield Air Station sits like a forgotten postcard in the endless Montana plains, where cattle outnumber visitors by 1,000 to 1. Once a critical hub for nuclear defense operations during the Cold War, it's been downgraded to what military brass politely call a strategic support facility. Bureaucratic speak for a place where careers go to hibernate. The towering radar installations that once swept the skies for incoming Soviet missiles now mostly track weather patterns and the occasional commercial airliner drifting off course. What was once America's first line of defense against nuclear annihilation has become a glorified administrative outpost, complete with a skeleton crew of personnel who've grown comfortable with the rhythm of routine paperwork and predictable peacetime operations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. At exactly 0445 hours every weekday morning, a battered white van with Mountain View catering services, painted in fading blue letters, pulls through the main gate of Ridgefield Air Station. The guards, Corporal Jake Thompson and Airman Michelle Davis, barely glance up from their coffee and morning newspapers anymore. They've seen this same van, driven by the same quiet woman, for the past 8 years running. The driver is Kylie DeVera, 38, a soft-spoken civilian contractor who's become as much a fixture of the base as the flagpole or the commissary. She arrives before sunrise, parks in the same spot near Building C, and begins her daily routine of ensuring that every person on Ridgefield Air Station has access to hot coffee, fresh pastries, and basic cafeteria services. To the 247 military personnel stationed at Ridgefield, Kylie is simply the coffee lady, a title that's delivered with varying degrees of affection, indifference, or mild irritation, depending on whether she's remembered their preferred cream-to-sugar ratio. She's the woman who refills the break room coffee makers, stocks the vending machines, and occasionally caters the monthly all-hands meetings with donuts that are surprisingly good for being delivered from the middle of nowhere. Most soldiers couldn't tell you her last name if their lives depended on it. To them, she's just another face in the background of military life, as unremarkable and necessary as the janitor or the mail clerk, Staff Sergeant Robert Keem, who's been stationed at Ridgefield for 3 years, probably summed up the general sentiment best during last month's poker game in the NCO lounge. Coffee lady's all right, I guess. Keeps the caffeine flowing and doesn't cause any drama. Though she's got this weird thing where she always asks about our families and remembers everyone's names. Kind of intense for someone who just pours coffee, you know? The comment had drawn nods of agreement from the other players, none of whom had ever considered that there might be more to Kylie DeVera than met the eye. The truth is, Kylie has deliberately cultivated this image of harmless invisibility. She arrives early, works efficiently, and leaves without fanfare. Her civilian contractor badge lists her job description as food service coordinator, and that's exactly how everyone sees her. The quiet woman who ensures the coffee is hot and the sandwich wraps are stocked. She moves through the base with the careful anonymity of someone who's learned that being overlooked can be its own form of protection. Her personnel file, maintained by the base's administrative office, is deliberately thin. Basic background check, emergency contact listed as none. Previous employment at various catering companies across the Mountain West. Nobody has ever bothered digging deeper because, frankly, nobody cares enough to ask. Kylie's daily routine is methodical and unremarkable. She unlocks the main cafeteria kitchen at 0500 hours, starts the industrial coffee machines, and begins preparing the breakfast service that feeds the early shift personnel. By 0630, she's manning the serving line, greeting each soldier with a smile and a genuine interest in how they're doing. She knows that Sergeant Martinez takes her coffee black, but loads up on cream for her afternoon cup. She remembers that Corporal Thompson is saving money for his wedding, and always appreciates when she sets aside the day-old pastries at a discount. She's aware that Airman Davis has been struggling with homesickness and makes sure to include extra cookies in her breakfast tray. These small acts of attention and care have earned Kylie a reputation as one of the good civilian contractors, someone who actually gives a damn about the people she serves. But they've also reinforced her image as a nurturing, maternal figure whose concerns don't extend beyond the kitchen and serving line. When soldiers think of Kylie de Vera, they think of comfort food and morning caffeine, not strategic defense or military operations, which is exactly what she spent 8 years working to achieve. The only person on base who occasionally looks at Kylie with something resembling curiosity is Master Sergeant David Chun, the grain logistics coordinator, who's been stationed at Ridgefield longer than anyone can remember. Sometimes when Kylie is serving breakfast, Chun catches himself studying her movements with a puzzled expression. There's something about the way she carries herself that doesn't quite match her civilian contractor role. Her posture is too straight, her awareness too sharp, her responses to military protocol too automatic for someone whose background is supposedly limited to food service. You ever notice anything unusual about the coffee lady? Chun had asked Major Foster during their weekly briefing last month. Something about her just seems that different. Foster had barely looked up from his paperwork. Different how? She makes decent coffee and keeps the troops fed. What more do you need to know? But Chun couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Kylie de Vera than anyone realized. The way she moved through the base wasn't the casual wandering of a civilian contractor. It was the purposeful navigation of someone who understood military installations from the inside out. When the base's emergency alert system conducted its monthly test, Chun noticed that Kylie would pause in her work for just a moment, not with the annoyed tolerance of a civilian hearing noise, but with the focused attention of someone whose survival had once depended on understanding what those sirens meant. Most telling of all was what happened during the severe thunderstorm last spring. While everyone else had taken shelter in the reinforced buildings, Chun had spotted Kylie through a window, standing alone in the cafeteria, watching the lightning with an expression he couldn't quite identify. It wasn't fear or casual interest. It was the look of someone conducting a threat assessment, cataloging variables and calculating risks with the automatic precision of trained military personnel. For 8 years, Kylie de Vera has been the invisible woman who keeps Ridgefield Air Station caffeinated and fed. She's become a ghost in plain sight, just another unremarkable face in the background of routine military life. The soldiers she serves every day have no idea that their coffee lady was once entrusted with some of the most classified and dangerous responsibilities in the United States military. They don't know that she chose this quiet, anonymous life deliberately, trading a career that demanded everything for a job that asked for nothing but reliability and discretion. But deep in her gut, the same instincts that had kept her alive through scenarios most people couldn't imagine were beginning to whisper that change was coming to Ridgefield Air Station. The comfortable routine that had protected her for 8 years was about to be shattered by forces beyond anyone's control. And when that moment arrived, the soldiers who'd spent years taking their coffee lady for granted were going to discover what kind of guardian angel had been walking among them all along, one cup of coffee at a time. Kylie's alarm clock never gets the chance to ring. Every morning at 04:15 hours, she's already awake, staring at the ceiling of her modest apartment in Cedar Falls, the small town 15 miles from Ridgefield Air Station. The habit of waking before dawn was carved into her nervous system years ago, and despite 8 years of civilian life, her body still operates on military time. She lies still for exactly 3 minutes, listening to the sounds of the world waking up around her, the distant rumble of early morning freight trains, the whisper of wind through the Montana grasslands, and the absolute silence that comes from living in a place where your nearest neighbor is half a mile away. By 0430, she's dressed in the same uniform she's worn for nearly a decade, khaki pants, A white polo shirt with the Mountain View Catering Services logo, and comfortable sneakers. That can handle 12 hours on her feet. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror shows a woman who's deliberately unremarkable, medium height, dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, minimal makeup, and the kind of pleasant but forgettable face that doesn't draw second glances. It's a carefully cultivated appearance, designed to blend into the background of any environment. The woman looking back at her bears little resemblance to the person she used to be. And that's exactly the point. The drive to Ridgefield Air Station takes exactly 18 minutes at the speed limit, a route Kylie has traveled more than 3,000 times. She knows every curve in the two-lane highway, every cattle guard, every fence post along the way. More importantly, she knows the sight lines, the potential choke points, and the optimal routes for rapid evacuation if circumstances ever demanded. These are assessments she makes automatically, without conscious thought, like a pilot checking instruments or a doctor monitoring vital signs. Old habits die hard, especially when those habits once meant the difference between life and death. At the base gate, Corporal Thompson and Airman Davis wave her through with the casual indifference of guards who've seen the same face pass through the same checkpoint for years. They don't bother checking her identification anymore, barely glancing up from their conversation about weekend plans and who's dating whom in the enlisted barracks. To them, Kylie is as much a part of the base's morning routine as the flag raising or the shift change. She's invisible in the way that familiar things become invisible, not because she can't be seen, but because she no longer registers as something worth noticing. The first stop is always the main cafeteria in Building C, where Kylie unlocks doors that most people assume are opened by base maintenance. In reality, she's one of only 3 civilians with after-hours access to this facility, a privilege that came with 8 years of proving herself reliable, trustworthy, and utterly unremarkable. She moves through the empty kitchen with the efficiency of someone who could navigate the space blindfolded, starting the massive coffee machines, checking the refrigeration units, and beginning the breakfast preparation that will feed nearly 200 people over the next 4 hours. The industrial kitchen at Ridgefield is better equipped than most civilian restaurants, a remnant from the days when this base housed 3 times as many personnel and operated around the clock. Kylie has learned every piece of equipment intimately, not just how to operate it, but how to repair it when things go wrong. When the main coffee machine broke down last winter, she had it running again in 20 minutes, while the base maintenance crew was still looking for the right tools. When questioned about her mechanical knowledge, she'd simply shrugged and mentioned picking up skills from her previous jobs. Nobody had bothered to ask what those previous jobs might have been. By 0600 hours, the cafeteria begins filling with early shift personnel grabbing coffee and breakfast before their duty assignments. Kylie takes her position behind the serving line, greeting each soldier with a smile that's genuine even if her background isn't. She's memorized not just their names and food preferences, but their personal details, their concerns, their small victories and daily struggles. Sergeant Martinez is worried about her teenage son's grades. Corporal Thompson is planning his wedding and stressing about the budget. Airman Davis misses her family in Ohio and calls home every Sunday without fail. These conversations happen in fragments, scattered across weeks and months of morning interactions. A question here, a sympathetic comment there, gradually building a network of relationships that most people would consider superficial, but that Kylie understands serve a much deeper purpose. In her previous life, situational awareness meant understanding threats and opportunities in a combat environment. In this life, it means understanding the emotional and social dynamics of a small military community. Both skill sets require the same fundamental ability, paying attention to details that other people miss. "Morning, Kylie," Sergeant Martinez says as she approaches the coffee station. "Got anything special today?" "Fresh blueberry muffins," Kylie replies, already pouring Martinez's coffee exactly the way she likes it. And I saved you one of the chocolate croissants you mentioned last week. These small gestures of attention and care have earned Kylie a reputation as someone who actually cares about the people she serves. But they've also reinforced her carefully constructed image as a nurturing, maternal figure whose concerns don't extend beyond ensuring that everyone gets fed properly. When soldiers think of Kylie de Vera, they think of comfort food and reliable service, not strategic operations or classified information. She's become the human equivalent of background music, pleasant, reliable, and easily forgotten. The morning routine extends beyond the cafeteria. After the breakfast rush ends at 0900, Kylie makes her rounds to the various break rooms and office buildings scattered across the base, refilling coffee machines, restocking vending machines, and checking inventory levels. These rounds give her legitimate access to nearly every building on Ridgefield Air Station, from the administrative offices to the communications center to the vehicle maintenance bay. It's access that would take most civilians months of security clearances and background checks to obtain, but that she's earned through the simple expedient of being the person who keeps everyone fed and caffeinated. During these rounds, Kylie observes everything and says nothing. She notices which offices are frequented by which personnel, which areas have upgraded security measures, which buildings contain equipment that seems oddly sophisticated for a strategic support facility. She's aware of the base's communication schedules, the patterns of personnel movement, and the subtle signs that indicate when something unusual is happening. This information sits in her mind like a detailed map, constantly updated but never shared, waiting for a purpose that she hopes will never come. But perhaps most importantly, these daily rounds have made Kylie functionally invisible to the people around her. After 8 years of reliable, unobtrusive service, she's achieved something that intelligence operatives spend careers trying to perfect: the ability to be present without being noticed. Soldiers hold conversations in front of her that they would never have in front of a security officer or a base commander. They discuss personnel issues, equipment problems, and operational concerns with the casual assumption that the coffee lady isn't really listening, and certainly isn't qualified to understand what she's hearing. If they only knew how much she understands, how many pieces of their conversations fit into larger puzzles that most of them can't even see, they might be more careful about what they say around the woman who serves their coffee. But Kylie has spent 8 years ensuring that they never have reason to suspect that their unremarkable coffee lady is anything more than she appears to be. And tomorrow, just like every day for the past 8 years, she wake up before dawn and do it all over again. The first crack in Kylie's carefully constructed facade appeared on a Tuesday morning in March, during what should have been a routine delivery to the base's communication center. She was restocking the break room coffee supplies when the emergency BROADCAST system activated for its monthly test. The piercing electronic tone that preceded all emergency alerts echoed through the building, followed by the robotic voice announcing, "This is a test of the emergency alert system." This is only a test. Most people barely registered the sound. It was as much a part of military routine as morning reveille or evening taps. But Master Sergeant Chun, who happened to be walking past the break room, noticed something unusual. Kylie had gone completely still, her hand frozen halfway to the coffee machine, her head tilted at a precise angle that suggested she was listening to something far more complex than a simple test announcement. For exactly 15 seconds, she stood motionless with the focused attention of someone whose survival had once depended on interpreting the subtleties of emergency communications. When the test ended, Kylie resumed her work as if nothing had happened, humming softly while she arranged coffee pods in their dispenser. But Chun had seen that moment of absolute stillness, that quality of attention that spoke of training far beyond civilian food service. He filed the observation away, adding it to a growing collection of small inconsistencies that didn't quite fit the image of a simple contract caterer. The second incident occurred 3 weeks later during a severe thunderstorm that knocked out power to half the base. While most personnel took shelter in the reinforced buildings, following standard protocols for severe weather, Kylie had remained in the main cafeteria, ostensibly to secure the kitchen equipment. Chun, making his rounds to ensure all civilian personnel were safely accounted for, found her standing at the large windows overlooking the flight line, watching the lightning with an expression he couldn't immediately identify. "Impressive storm," Chun had commented, approaching her position near the window. "Electromagnetic pulse," Kylie had replied without turning around. Lightning strike of that intensity could disrupt unshielded electronics within a half-mile radius. "We should expect temporary communication failures and possible damage to sensitive equipment." Chun had stared at her, processing not just what she'd said, but how she'd said it. The terminology was precise, technical, and delivered with the casual confidence of someone who understood electromagnetic phenomena at a level far beyond what any food service contractor should possess. When Kylie realized what she'd revealed, she'd quickly covered with a self-deprecating laugh. "Sorry, I watch way too much Discovery Channel," she'd said, returning to her task of securing the kitchen equipment. "My ex-husband was an electronics technician. Guess some of it rubbed off." But Chun knew the difference between Discovery Channel trivia and professional-level understanding of electromagnetic warfare principles. He'd spent enough years in military communications to recognize expertise when he heard it, even when it was being hastily disguised as casual knowledge. From that moment forward, he began paying closer attention to the woman everyone called the Coffee Lady. The observations accumulated slowly, like pieces of a puzzle scattered across months of routine interactions. There was the way Kylie moved through the base, not with the uncertain navigation of a civilian contractor, but with the purposeful efficiency of someone who understood military installations from the inside out. She knew which buildings required badge access without checking the signs. She understood the base's security protocols well enough to move through restricted areas without triggering alerts or requiring escort. Most telling of all, she seemed to anticipate the flow of personnel movements with an accuracy that suggested intimate familiarity with military operational patterns. Chen also noticed that Kylie's knowledge of the base extended far beyond what her job required. She knew the names and ranks of personnel she'd never served coffee to, understood the chain of command in departments she'd never visited, and occasionally made offhand references to equipment and procedures that were well outside the scope of food service operations. When Airman Davis mentioned struggling with a computer problem in the communications center, Kylie had suggested a specific troubleshooting sequence that solved the issue immediately. When Corporal Thompson complained about his vehicle making unusual noises, she diagnosed a timing belt problem with automotive knowledge that impressed the base's motor pool sergeant. Each incident was small, easily explained away or forgotten in the routine of daily military life. But collectively, they painted a picture of someone with a background far more complex than her personnel file suggested. Chun began conducting his own quiet investigation, reviewing Kylie's employment records and trying to trace her work history before she'd arrived at Ridgefield Air Station. What he found was a carefully constructed paper trail that revealed almost nothing substantial about her previous experience. The breakthrough came during a conversation with Sergeant Martinez about base security procedures. Kylie had been serving lunch when Martinez mentioned concern about potential vulnerabilities in the perimeter monitoring systems. Without thinking, Kylie had launched into a detailed analysis of motion sensor placement, infrared detection gaps, and the tactical advantages of approaching the base from the northeast during certain weather conditions. The discussion had lasted nearly 10 minutes before Kylie seemed to realize she was revealing knowledge that no civilian caterer should possess. "I probably read too many Tom Clancy novels," she'd said with an embarrassed smile. quickly changing the subject to afternoon dessert options. But Sergeant Martinez had exchanged a meaningful look with Chun across the cafeteria. Both men were experienced enough to recognize the difference between fiction-based speculation and professional-level tactical analysis. Kylie de Vera had just demonstrated intimate knowledge of Ridgefield Air Station security systems and defensive capabilities, delivered with the casual precision of someone who'd spent considerable time thinking about such matters from an operational perspective. That evening, Chun sat in his office reviewing personnel files and trying to piece together the mystery of their coffee lady. Kylie's employment application listed previous positions with various catering companies across the Mountain West, but the references were either disconnected phone numbers or businesses that had conveniently closed. Her emergency contact was listed as none, which was unusual enough to be noteworthy. Most suspicious of all, her social security number traced back to a legitimate identity, but one with a work history that began exactly 8 years ago, right around the time she'd started at Ridgefield Air Station. Chun had seen enough classified personnel files to recognize the hallmarks of a carefully constructed cover identity. The question was whether Kylie de Vera was hiding from something dangerous, or hiding something dangerous about herself. Given her demonstrated knowledge of military operations, electromagnetic warfare, tactical analysis, and base security systems, Chun was beginning to suspect it might be the latter. The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. During a casual conversation with his counterpart at Malmstrom Air Force Base, Chun had mentioned their long-term civilian contractor, who seemed unusually knowledgeable about military operations. His colleague had paused for a long moment before asking if the contractor was a woman in her late 30s with dark hair and an uncanny ability to blend into the background. Chun, his colleague, had said quietly, "I think you need to know something about your coffee lady." But this conversation never happened, and what I'm about to tell you stays between us. What Chun learned in that conversation would change everything he thought he knew about Kylie de Vera, and more importantly, it would help him understand why a woman with her particular skill set might choose to spend 8 years serving coffee on a forgotten military base in Montana. The question was no longer who Kylie used to be. The question was what she was preparing for. Colonel Marcus Blackwood arrived at Ridgefield Air Station on a gray Monday morning in April, with all the subtlety of a Category 5 hurricane making landfall. His convoy of 3 black SUVs and a military transport truck rolled through the main gate at precisely 0800 hours, dust clouds billowing behind them like smoke signals announcing the arrival of a new era. The 41-year-old colonel emerged from the lead vehicle wearing dress blues adorned with enough ribbons and commendations to outfit a small parade, his bearing rigid with the kind of military precision that comes from decades of climbing the career ladder one calculated step at a time. Blackwood was everything the previous base commander, Colonel William Harrison, had not been. Where Harrison had been content to manage Ridgefield as a quiet support facility, focusing on maintenance operations and administrative efficiency, Blackwood arrived with ambitious plans and an ego that matched his aspirations. Fresh from a prestigious Pentagon assignment where he'd earned recognition for streamlining operational protocols and maximizing resource utilization, he saw Ridgefield Air Station as either a stepping stone to bigger commands or a career graveyard, depending entirely on how successfully he could transform what he viewed as a forgotten backwater into a model of military efficiency. The colonel's first order of business was a comprehensive review of all base operations, a process he announced during his initial all-hands meeting in the main auditorium. Standing behind the podium with the bearing of a man accustomed to having his words treated as gospel, Blackwood surveyed the assembled personnel with the calculating gaze of someone mentally cataloging assets and liabilities. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone who'd never learned to doubt his own importance, I've spent the past week reviewing the operational status of this installation, and what I've found is deeply concerning. For too long, Ridgefield Air Station has operated under relaxed standards that would be unacceptable at any serious military facility. That ends today. The announcement sent a ripple of unease through the assembled troops. Colonel Harrison had been popular with the enlisted personnel, known for his hands-off management style and his understanding that Ridgefield's mission didn't require the rigid protocols of an active combat base. Blackwood, it seemed, had very different ideas about how a military installation should function. Effective immediately, Blackwood continued, we will be implementing new security protocols, revised duty schedules, and enhanced oversight procedures for all base operations. This includes civilian contractors who have been operating with insufficient supervision and accountability. We are going to run this installation like the strategic military facility it was designed to be, not like some rural community center. Master Sergeant Chun, sitting in the third row with the other senior NCOs, felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. He glanced around the auditorium, noting the expressions of confusion and concern on the faces of soldiers who'd grown comfortable with Ridgefield's relaxed atmosphere. More troubling was the absence of any civilian contractors at the meeting. Blackwood hadn't bothered to include them in his announcement, treating them as afterthoughts rather than integral parts of the base's operations. After the meeting, Chun made his way to the main cafeteria, where he found Kylie preparing for the lunch service with her usual quiet efficiency. She was arranging sandwich ingredients behind the serving line, her movements methodical and precise, but Chun noticed a tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. "Morning, Kylie," Chun said, approaching the counter with the casual manner of someone making routine conversation. "Heard we got a new commander today." Kylie looked up from her work, and for just a moment, Chun saw something flicker in her eyes, not concern or curiosity, but the kind of analytical assessment that suggested she was processing implications far beyond what a civilian contractor should be considering. "Colonel Blackwood," she replied neutrally. "I saw the convoy arrive this morning. Quite an entrance." "He's planning some changes," Chun continued, watching her reaction carefully. "New security protocols, enhanced oversight for civilian contractors. Things are going to be different around here." Kylie nodded slowly, her expression remaining carefully neutral. But Chun noticed that her hands had gone still on the sandwich ingredients, and when she resumed her work, her movements had taken on the careful precision of someone who was thinking several steps ahead. "Change can be good," she said finally, "though I hope it doesn't interfere with keeping everyone fed properly. Soldiers need reliable meal service, regardless of who's in command." It was a perfectly reasonable response from a food service contractor, concerned about her ability to do her job effectively. But Chun heard something else in her tone, a subtle note of evaluation, as if she were already calculating how Blackwood's changes might affect not just her work, but the broader operational dynamics of the base. Blackwood's transformation of Ridgefield Air Station began immediately and with typical military efficiency. Within 48 hours, new security badges had been issued to all personnel, with civilian contractors receiving distinctly different identification that limited their access to previously unrestricted areas. Work schedules were revised to eliminate what Blackwood termed inefficient overlap periods, and new reporting requirements were implemented for all non-military personnel. The changes hit the civilian contractors hardest. People who'd been working the same jobs for years suddenly found themselves navigating bureaucratic obstacles that made simple tasks complicated and time-consuming. Maintenance requests that had previously been handled with a phone call now required written authorization from department heads. Access to buildings that contractors had entered freely for routine service now required military escort. Most frustrating of all, the new protocol seemed designed to establish clear hierarchical distinctions between military personnel and civilian support staff, creating an atmosphere of us versus them that hadn't existed under Colonel Harrison's leadership. For Kylie, the changes meant that her carefully established routines were suddenly subject to scrutiny and restriction. Her morning rounds to restock break room coffee machines now required prior approval and scheduled time slots. Her access to the communications center, where she'd been maintaining the break room coffee service for 8 years, was suspended pending a comprehensive security review of civilian contractor activities in sensitive areas. But perhaps most concerning was Blackwood's announced intention to conduct individual performance reviews with all civilian contractors. The meetings, scheduled to begin the following week, were ostensibly designed to optimize contractor utilization and ensure appropriate skill-to-assignment matching. In reality, they represented a systematic evaluation of every non-military person working on the base, with the clear implication that some positions might be deemed unnecessary or inefficient. Kylie received her review appointment notice on Friday afternoon, Monday, 1400 hours, Colonel Blackwood's office. As she read the brief, formal notification, Chun happened to be in the cafeteria picking up his afternoon coffee. He watched her face as she processed the information, noting the way her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before she folded the paper and slipped it into her apron pocket. "Everything all right?" Chun asked, though he suspected he already knew what the notification contained. "Performance review with the new colonel," Kylie replied, her tone carefully neutral. "Sounds like he wants to make sure everyone's pulling their weight around here." Chun nodded sympathetically, but he was thinking about the conversation he'd had with his colleague at Malmstrom Air Force Base. If his suspicions about Kylie's background were correct, then Colonel Blackwood was about to conduct a performance review with someone whose qualifications were so far beyond her apparent job description that the meeting might prove illuminating for both parties involved. What Blackwood didn't know was that he was implementing security changes and oversight procedures under the watchful eye of someone who understood such systems from a perspective he couldn't imagine. Someone who'd spent 8 years observing Ridgefield Air Station's operations with the trained eye of a professional, who knew exactly what vulnerabilities existed and how they might be exploited. Colonel Marcus Blackwood thought he was taking command of a sleepy support facility, staffed by complacent personnel who needed firm leadership and military discipline. He had no idea that his biggest challenge wouldn't be motivating lazy soldiers or streamlining inefficient procedures. His biggest challenge would be recognizing the difference between a threat and an asset before he made a mistake that could cost everyone on Ridgefield Air Station their lives. The transformation of Ridgefield Air Station under Colonel Blackwood's command accelerated with the relentless efficiency of a military operation, designed to overwhelm resistance through sheer bureaucratic force. Within 2 weeks of his arrival, every aspect of base life had been subjected to what he called optimization protocols, a comprehensive restructuring that affected everything from duty rosters to meal service schedules. The changes weren't just administrative. They represented a fundamental shift in the base's culture, from the relaxed professionalism that had characterized Colonel Harrison's leadership to the rigid hierarchy that Blackwood believed was essential for proper military discipline for the civilian contractors. These changes felt less like optimization and more like systematic harassment designed to make their jobs as difficult as possible. Kylie experienced this firsthand when she arrived for her usual 0500 hours kitchen access and found that her security badge no longer worked. A hastily printed notice taped to the cafeteria door informed all civilian personnel that new access protocols required prior authorization for any entry into food service areas outside of designated operating hours. What had been a simple matter of unlocking the door and beginning breakfast preparation now required Kylie to wait until 0530, when the duty officer could escort her to the kitchen and verify that her presence was authorized. The 30-minute delay might seem insignificant, but its impact rippled through the entire morning routine. Breakfast service, which had run like clockwork for 8 years, now started late and operated under the constant pressure of compressed time schedules. Soldiers accustomed to grabbing quick coffee and pastries before their duty shifts found themselves waiting in longer lines for service that felt rushed and impersonal. The easy camaraderie that had characterized morning interactions between Kylie and the troops gradually gave way to the stressed efficiency of people trying to accomplish familiar tasks under unfamiliar constraints. Major Derek Foster, Blackwood's newly appointed deputy commander and most enthusiastic enforcer of the new protocols, seemed to take particular pleasure in ensuring that civilian contractors understood their diminished status in the base hierarchy. A career officer who'd spent more time pushing paperwork than leading troops, Foster had embraced his role as Blackwood's enforcer with the zealousness of someone finally given real authority after years of middle management frustration. The problem with this place, Foster explained to Staff Sergeant Kim during one of his impromptu inspections of the cafeteria operation, is that civilian contractors have been allowed to operate without proper oversight for too long. They've gotten comfortable, started thinking they're part of the team instead of hired help. Colonel Blackwood is going to fix that. Foster's inspections became a weekly ordeal that transformed routine food service into a military exercise in enduring petty authority. He would arrive unannounced during peak service hours, clipboard in hand, looking for violations of protocols that seemed to change daily. One week, he criticized Kylie for maintaining insufficient separation between raw and cooked food items, citing regulations that didn't exist in any food service manual. The following week, he wrote her up for inefficient utilization of serving line space, a complaint so vague that even Kylie's request for clarification was dismissed as evidence of her inability to understand basic operational requirements. The harassment extended beyond direct criticism to systematic interference with established routines. Kylie's morning rounds to restock break room coffee supplies, which had been a simple matter of loading a cart and making her deliveries, now required advanced scheduling and military escort. What had taken 45 minutes now consumed nearly 2 hours, as she waited for available escorts and navigated the bureaucratic approval process for accessing each building on her route. But perhaps most frustrating was the implementation of what Blackwood called contractor accountability measures, detailed login requirements that forced civilian personnel to document every aspect of their work in 15-minute increments. Kylie found herself spending nearly an hour each day filling out forms that tracked her movements, activities, and interactions with military personnel. The paperwork served no apparent purpose beyond creating additional administrative burden, but failure to complete it properly resulted in formal reprimands that went into personnel files. The psychological impact of these changes extended far beyond their practical inconvenience. Blackwood and Foster had succeeded in creating an atmosphere where civilian contractors felt like unwelcome guests being tolerated, rather than valued team members contributing to the base's mission. The casual conversations and friendly interactions that had characterized relationships between military and civilian personnel gradually gave way to formal exchanges marked by awareness that every interaction was potentially subject to scrutiny and criticism. Master Sergeant Chun watched these developments with growing concern, not just for their impact on base morale, but for their specific effect on Kylie. During their brief conversations, now necessarily more careful and formal, due to the increased scrutiny of civilian-military interactions, he noticed subtle changes in her demeanor that suggested she was operating under considerable stress. The easy confidence that had characterized her movements around the base was being replaced by the careful precision of someone who knew she was being watched and evaluated. More troubling were the small signs that Kylie was beginning to withdraw from the informal information network that had developed over 8 years of daily interactions with base personnel. She no longer lingered for casual conversation during coffee service, no longer asked about soldiers' families or personal concerns, no longer offered the small gestures of attention and care that had made her popular with the troops. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. She was pulling back, becoming more guarded, preparing defensive positions that suggested she sensed larger threats approaching. The breaking point came during the third week of Blackwood's command, when Foster implemented what he called enhanced security protocols for sensitive area access. The new rules required all civilian contractors to undergo daily security briefings before entering any building that contained communication equipment, computer systems, or classified materials. Since this description covered virtually every structure on Ridgefield Air Station, the practical effect was that contractors needed permission and escort for activities they'd been performing independently for years for Kylie. This meant that restocking the break room coffee in the communications center, a 5-minute task she'd performed daily for 8 years, now required scheduling a security briefing, waiting for an available escort, and completing additional paperwork documenting her activities in the sensitive area. When she pointed out that the communication center break room contained nothing more sensitive than coffee filters and sugar packets, Foster's response was swift and dismissive. "Miss De Vera," he said with the condescending tone of someone addressing a particularly slow student, "security protocols aren't suggestions, they're requirements. If you're unable to adapt to proper military procedures, perhaps you should consider whether this position is really suitable for someone with your limited understanding of security requirements." The threat was clear, delivered with a smile that didn't reach Foster's eyes. Kylie nodded politely and agreed to comply with whatever protocols were deemed necessary. But Chun, who happened to witness the exchange while picking up his afternoon coffee, noticed something in her expression that made him deeply uncomfortable. For just a moment, Kylie's carefully maintained mask of civilian deference had slipped, revealing something underneath that looked less like submission and more like cold professional evaluation. That evening, as Chun completed his daily reports in the quiet of his office, he found himself thinking about the conversation he'd had with his colleague at Malmstrom Air Force Base. If his suspicions about Kylie's background were correct, then Foster's casual dismissal of her limited understanding of security requirements represented a level of irony that bordered on the dangerous. Because if Kylie De Vera was who Chun increasingly suspected she might be, then she understood security requirements at a level that would make Foster's head spin. The question was no longer whether Blackwood and Foster would push her too far. The question was what would happen when they did. The humiliation came on a Wednesday morning that began like any other, with Kylie arriving at Ridgefield Air Station at her usual time, coffee in hand and resigned to navigating whatever new bureaucratic obstacle had been created overnight. She'd grown accustomed to the daily indignities that came with Blackwood's optimization protocols, the delayed access, the mandatory escorts, the endless paperwork that seemed designed to consume time rather than serve any legitimate purpose. But what happened that morning crossed a line that even 8 years of careful self-control couldn't prepare her for. The trouble started when she arrived at the communications center to restock the break room coffee supplies, a task that had become a complicated 30-minute procedure requiring advanced scheduling and military escort. Sergeant Lisa Martinez was supposed to meet her at 0800 hours to provide the mandatory oversight. But when Kylie arrived at the designated time, Martinez was nowhere to be found. A quick inquiry at the main desk revealed that Martinez had been reassigned to an emergency maintenance issue and wouldn't be available until at least 1,000 hours. Under the old system, this would have been a minor inconvenience easily resolved by a phone call or a brief delay. Under Blackwood's protocols, it represented a violation of established procedures that could result in formal disciplinary action. Kylie was faced with a choice: abandon her scheduled task and disrupt the coffee service that personnel depended on, or proceed with her work and risk the consequences of operating without proper authorization. She chose a third option, deciding to wait in the communications center lobby until Martinez became available. It was a reasonable compromise that demonstrated her commitment to following protocols while ensuring that essential services weren't disrupted. Unfortunately, it was also the choice that put her in Major Foster's path when he arrived for his weekly inspection of the communications facility. Foster found Kylie sitting quietly in the lobby, her supply cart positioned neatly against the wall, reading a paperback novel to pass the time while she waited for her authorized escort. To most observers, she would have appeared to be a patient contractor following proper procedures and making the best use of unavoidable downtime. To Foster, she represented an opportunity to demonstrate his authority and reinforce the hierarchical distinctions that Blackwood's command was working to establish. "Miss De Vera," Foster said with the sharp tone of someone who'd found exactly what he was looking for, "what exactly are you doing in this facility without proper authorization?" Kylie looked up from her book, maintaining the polite expression. She'd perfected over 8 years of dealing with difficult situations. "Good morning, Major Foster. I'm waiting for Sergeant Martinez to provide escort for coffee service in the break room. She was delayed by an emergency maintenance issue." Foster's eyes narrowed as he processed this information, clearly looking for an angle of attack. "And you thought it was appropriate to simply set up camp in a sensitive communications facility. While you wait, do you have any understanding of the security protocols governing this building?" The question was loaded with condescension and designed to make Kylie feel foolish for following the exact procedures that had been mandated by Blackwood's administration. But it also revealed Foster's fundamental misunderstanding of both the situation and the person he was addressing. Because if he'd known anything about Kylie's actual background, he would have realized that her understanding of communications facility security protocols was probably more comprehensive than his own. "I apologize if my presence here is inappropriate," Kylie replied carefully. "I was trying to balance following proper escort requirements with maintaining scheduled service. Would you prefer that I reschedule for another day?" It was a perfectly reasonable response that demonstrated respect for authority, while highlighting the practical complications created by the new protocols. But Foster wasn't interested in reasonable solutions. He was interested in establishing dominance and making sure that civilian contractors understood their place in his version of military hierarchy. "What I would prefer," Foster said, his voice rising to ensure that everyone in the communications center could hear, "is for civilian personnel to understand that this is a military installation, not a coffee shop. Your job is to serve food when and where you're told, not to camp out in sensitive areas because your schedule gets disrupted." The public nature of the dressing down was clearly intentional. Several military personnel had gathered to watch the confrontation, some out of curiosity, others with expressions of uncomfortable sympathy for Kylie's situation. Foster was making an example of her, demonstrating to everyone present that civilian contractors who failed to show proper deference would be dealt with swiftly and publicly. But Foster made a critical error in his choice of venue for this demonstration, because among the gathered personnel was Staff Sergeant Robert Kim, who'd been working in communications for 6 years and had developed considerable respect for Kylie's professionalism and reliability. Kim had also noticed things about Kylie over the years, small details that suggested her background was more complex than her job description indicated. "Sir," Kim interjected quietly, "with respect, Miss De Vera has been providing excellent service to this facility for years. She's always been professional and respectful of our security requirements." Foster turned his attention to Kim with the irritated expression of someone whose authority had been questioned. "Staff Sergeant, I don't recall asking for your opinion on contractor performance. Perhaps you've also become too comfortable with relaxed standards around here." The implied threat was clear, and Kim wisely stepped back rather than escalate the confrontation further. But the damage was done. Foster had managed to humiliate not just Kylie, but also a respected NCO who'd tried to speak up for her. The message to everyone present was unmistakable, challenging the new order, even in defense of obviously unfair treatment, would result in consequences for military personnel as well as contractors. Kylie endured the remainder of Foster's lecture with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained throughout 8 years of deliberate invisibility. She nodded at appropriate intervals, acknowledged her supposed failings, and promised to do better in the future. But Master Sergeant Chun, who'd arrived during the confrontation, noticed something that Foster missed entirely. Behind Kylie's carefully maintained expression of respectful submission, something cold and dangerous was calculating options. When Foster finally finished his performance and stalked away, the communications center fell into uncomfortable silence. Personnel returned to their duties with the awkward awareness that they'd witnessed something that went beyond necessary discipline into the realm of deliberate cruelty. Kylie quietly gathered her supplies and left without a word, but not before Chun caught a glimpse of her expression when she thought no one was watching. It wasn't the look of a humiliated contractor accepting her diminished status. It was the look of a professional warrior who'd just been publicly disrespected by someone she could destroy without breaking a sweat. For 8 years, Kylie DeVera had chosen to serve coffee instead of exercising the skills that had once made her one of the most dangerous people in the American military. But Foster's public humiliation had cracked something in that carefully maintained facade, revealing glimpses of the person she'd been before she'd chosen invisibility over recognition. Chun found himself hoping that Foster was smart enough to recognize he'd crossed a line. Because if Chun's suspicions about Kylie's background were correct, then the Major had just made an enemy who was far more dangerous than he could possibly imagine. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The transformation in Kylie DeVera began that very afternoon, subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew how to recognize the signs of a professional preparing for war. She returned to her duties with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized 8 years of service. But Master Sergeant Chun noticed differences that spoke of fundamental changes happening beneath the surface. Her movements had acquired a new quality of precision. Her awareness had sharpened to a level that suggested constant threat assessment, and most tellingly, she'd begun asking questions that revealed knowledge no civilian contractor should possess. First indication came during the evening inventory of kitchen supplies, a routine task that Kylie performed alone after the dinner service ended. Chun, working late in his office adjacent to the main cafeteria, overheard her making phone calls to suppliers about emergency food procurement protocols and backup storage procedures. The conversations were conducted in the professional shorthand of someone familiar with contingency planning at a level far beyond normal commercial catering concerns. "I need to know your capability for emergency resupply in the event of base lockdown," he heard her saying to what sounded like a regional food distributor. "Specifically, what's your surge capacity for feeding 250 personnel for an extended period without external logistics support?" The question was technically within the scope of a food service coordinator's responsibilities, but the terminology and the underlying assumptions revealed thinking that operated on a strategic rather than operational level. Chun found himself wondering what kind of emergency scenarios Kylie was preparing for, and more importantly, what her background had taught her about the likelihood of such scenarios actually occurring. Over the following days, Chun began paying closer attention to Kylie's activities, noting changes that might have escaped the notice of less observant personnel. She'd started conducting what appeared to be detailed surveys of the base's infrastructure, paying particular attention to communication systems, power distribution networks, and transportation assets. These observations were conducted during Her normal duties, disguised as routine maintenance checks or casual interest, but they revealed a systematic intelligence-gathering operation that was far beyond the scope of food service. Requirements. The breakthrough in Chun's understanding came from an unexpected source. While reviewing supply requisitions for the monthly logistics report, he noticed that Kylie had submitted requests for emergency rations, portable water purification tablets, and industrial-grade batteries, items that had no apparent connection to normal cafeteria operations. When he inquired about these unusual purchases, Kylie's explanation was smooth and seemingly reasonable. Colonel Blackwood's emphasis on preparedness got me thinking about our emergency response capabilities, she said with the kind of earnest professionalism that deflected suspicion. If we ever face a situation where normal supply lines are disrupted, we need to be able to maintain basic nutrition for base personnel. I'm just trying to be proactive about potential contingencies. It was a perfectly logical explanation that demonstrated responsible planning and attention to detail. But Chun noticed that the quantities she'd requested were precisely calculated for the current base population, and the specific items suggested familiarity with military field rations and emergency protocols that went well beyond civilian disaster preparedness. Someone with Kylie's apparent background shouldn't have known the caloric requirements for maintaining combat effectiveness in high-stress situations. Yet her supply requests indicated exactly that level of expertise. More suspicious was Kylie's sudden interest in the base's communication systems. During her daily rounds, she'd begun asking technical questions about radio protocols, satellite uplink capabilities, and emergency broadcasting procedures. These inquiries were framed as curiosity about how to stay informed during emergencies. But the specificity of her questions revealed understanding of military communications that civilian contractors weren't supposed to possess. Staff Sergeant Kim, still smarting from his confrontation with Foster, found himself the recipient of increasingly sophisticated questions about the communications center's capabilities. Kylie's inquiries about backup power systems, signal encryption, and transmission range were delivered with the casual interest of someone making conversation, but they demonstrated knowledge of technical concepts that should have been well outside her area of expertise. She asked me about our hardened communication protocols yesterday, Kim confided to Chun during a quiet moment in the communications center. Wanted to know about our capability to maintain contact with regional command during electromagnetic interference events. That's not the kind of thing someone learns from watching the Discovery Channel. Chun nodded thoughtfully, adding this information to his growing collection of evidence that Kylie de Vera was not who she appeared to be. But perhaps most telling was what happened when Chun decided to test his suspicions directly. During a casual conversation about base security, he mentioned concerns about potential vulnerabilities in Ridgefield's defensive perimeter. Kylie's response revealed tactical analysis that would have impressed a career infantry officer. The main weakness is the eastern approach, she said without hesitation, then seemed to catch herself. I mean, from what I can see during my morning drives, the terrain there offers the most concealment for anyone who might want to approach undetected. Not that I've really thought about it seriously. But she had thought about it seriously, and in considerable detail. Chun could see the wheels turning behind her eyes as she mentally cataloged sightlines, defensive positions, and potential infiltration routes with the automatic precision of someone trained in tactical assessment. The casual disclaimer at the end of her statement only served to highlight how thoroughly she'd analyzed Ridgefield's vulnerabilities. The final piece of the puzzle came when Chun decided to conduct his own background investigation using resources available to senior NCOs with appropriate security clearances. What he discovered about Kylie de Vera's identity confirmed his worst fears and explained everything he'd observed over the past 8 years. The woman serving coffee to his troops wasn't just a civilian contractor with an unusually comprehensive understanding of military operations. She was a ghost from a program so classified that most people would never know it had existed. Armed with this knowledge, Chun found himself facing an impossible decision. His duty required him to report security concerns to his commanding officer. But revealing Kylie's true identity to Colonel Blackwood and Major Foster could have consequences that extended far beyond Ridgefield Air Station. If Chun was right about who Kylie de Vera really was, then she was at Ridgefield for reasons that had nothing to do with serving coffee and everything to do with protecting assets that Blackwood didn't even know existed. That evening, Chun sat in his quarters staring at a classified personnel file that officially didn't exist, trying to decide whether to trust his instincts or follow regulations. The file contained a photograph of a woman in military dress uniform, her chest adorned with commendations that told the story of service in places and operations that remained classified years after their completion. The woman in the photograph looked younger and harder than the person who'd been serving his coffee for 8 years, but the eyes were unmistakably the same. According to the file, Lieutenant Colonel Catherine Kaylee de Vera had been declared killed in action during a classified operation 8 years ago. Her specialty had been nuclear threat assessment and containment, and her security clearance had been so high that her death had been reported only to a handful of people in the Pentagon. If the file was accurate, then the woman everyone called the Coffee Lady was not only very much alive, but was one of the most qualified nuclear defense specialists in the American military. The question was no longer what Kylie was preparing for. The question was what she knew that nobody else did, and whether Ridgefield Air Station was about to face the kind of threat that required someone with her particular expertise to handle. Chun had a sinking feeling that he was about to find out, and that when that moment came, Colonel Blackwood's bureaucratic efficiency protocols weren't going to be much help against the kind of enemies that would bring a nuclear specialist out of hiding after 8 years of deliberate invisibility. The first indication that Wednesday, May 15th would be different from any other day in Ridgefield Air Station's recent history came at 0347 hours, when the base's long-range radar detection systems registered multiple airborne contacts approaching from the northwest at high altitude and extreme velocity. Staff Sergeant Kim, manning the communications center during the quiet overnight shift, initially dismissed the contacts as a computer glitch or atmospheric interference. The radar signatures were moving too fast to be conventional aircraft, and their trajectory suggested they were following a ballistic path rather than controlled flight. It took Kim exactly 43 seconds to realize that what he was seeing on his screen wasn't a malfunction. It was the nightmare scenario that Ridgefield Air Station had been designed to detect during the Cold War, updated for modern threats that moved faster and carried payloads more devastating than anything the original designers had imagined. The contacts weren't aircraft at all. They were incoming ballistic missiles, and their projected impact points placed them squarely in the center of the North American continent. Kim's training took over with automatic precision. He activated the base-wide alert system, sending the piercing wail of emergency klaxons echoing across Ridgefield Air Station at a volume and intensity that hadn't been heard since the system's installation decades earlier. Within minutes, personnel were stumbling from their quarters in various states of dress, confused and disoriented by an alarm that most of them had never heard outside of scheduled drills. Colonel Blackwood burst into the communications center, still pulling on his uniform jacket, his face pale with the sudden realization that his carefully planned administrative efficiency had just been rendered irrelevant by events he'd never seriously considered. "Report," he barked, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from desperation rather than confidence. "Sir, we have multiple inbound ballistic contacts," Kim replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was reporting. "Estimated time to impact is 17 minutes based on current trajectory and velocity. The signatures are consistent, with intercontinental ballistic missiles carrying nuclear warheads." The words hit Blackwood like a physical blow. In all his years of military service, climbing the ladder through staff assignments and Pentagon rotations, he'd never faced a situation that demanded real-time decision-making with consequences measured in hundreds of thousands of lives. His experience was in optimizing protocols and streamlining procedures, not in managing the kind of crisis that could end civilization as they knew it. "Response options," Blackwood demanded, though his voice betrayed the fact that he had no idea what those options might be. "Sir," Kim replied with the patience of someone explaining obvious facts to a superior officer, "we don't have any. Ridgefield hasn't maintained active missile defense capabilities since 2009. We're a monitoring station, not an intercept facility. Our job is to detect and report, not to engage." The brutal reality of Ridgefield's actual capabilities settled over the communications center like a suffocating blanket. For all of Blackwood's emphasis on military efficiency and proper protocols, the base he commanded was essentially defenseless against the kind of threat that was bearing down on them. They could watch the incoming missiles on their screens. They could calculate impact times with mathematical precision, but they couldn't do anything to stop what was about to happen. Major Foster, who'd arrived in the communications center with his usual swagger, now looked like he might collapse from the weight of understanding their situation. "Sir, what about regional command? Can't we contact Malmstrom or Warren Air Force Base for intercept support?" Kim shook his head grimly. "Already tried, sir. We're getting no response from either facility. Either their communications are down, or ... double quotes." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood the implication that other military installations might already be under attack. Blackwood stared at the radar screen showing the inexorable approach of the incoming missiles, his mind struggling to process the gap between his administrative experience and the reality of nuclear warfare. In all his planning for optimizing base operations, he'd never seriously considered that Ridgefield might actually need to function as a military installation rather than a bureaucratic outpost. Now faced with the ultimate test of military preparedness, he was discovering that organizational charts and efficiency metrics were useless against intercontinental ballistic missiles. "Options," he repeated desperately, though it was clear he was asking a question that had no good answers. It was at that moment that Kylie DeVera walked into the communications center with the calm purposefulness of someone who'd been expecting this day for 8 years. She was dressed in her usual civilian contractor clothes, but there was something different about her bearing that made everyone in the room take notice. The quiet deference that had characterized her interactions with military personnel was gone, replaced by the confident authority of someone who understood the situation better than anyone else present. "Colonel Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying a tone of professional respect that somehow managed to sound like she was addressing an equal rather than a superior officer. "I need to know the exact coordinates and estimated yield of the incoming warheads." Blackwood turned to stare at her with confusion and irritation. "Miss DeVera, this is a restricted area during emergency operations. Civilian personnel need to report to designated shelter areas immediately." Kylie looked at him with the patient expression of someone explaining something to a child. "Sir, with respect, I'm not going anywhere. Those missiles are carrying nuclear warheads with an estimated yield of at least 500 kilotons each. If they reach their targets, we're looking at casualties in the hundreds of thousands and radioactive contamination that will make large portions of the Midwest uninhabitable for decades. This isn't a drill, and it's not a time for following contractor oversight protocols." The authority in her voice was unmistakable, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Ridgefield Air Station, Kylie DeVera sounded like exactly what she was: a military officer with experience in the kind of crisis that was unfolding around them. Blackwood stared at her with growing confusion, beginning to realize that his coffee lady knew things about nuclear warfare that he definitely didn't. "How do you know about warhead yields?" Foster demanded, his voice shrill with stress and confusion. "Kylie, turned her attention to Foster with the kind of look that could freeze water. "Major, I know about warhead yields because I've spent my career studying them. I know about nuclear weapons because I'm trained to deal with them. And I know that we have approximately 12 minutes to implement countermeasures, or everyone within a 50-mile radius of this base is going to die." The silence that followed was broken only by the steady beeping of the radar screen, tracking the incoming missiles, and the distant sound of personnel running to emergency stations across the base. In that moment, everyone in the communications center began to understand that they'd been serving coffee to someone whose background was far more complex and far more relevant to their current situation than anyone had imagined. Master Sergeant Chun, who'd been watching the exchange with growing recognition, stepped forward with the classified personnel file he'd been carrying since his investigation began. "Colonel," he said quietly, "I think there's something you need to know about our coffee lady." But before Chun could explain, Kylie was already moving toward the communications console with the confident efficiency of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. "We don't have time for explanations," she said, her hands already working the radio controls with practiced expertise. "If we're going to survive the next 12 minutes, you need to trust me and do exactly what I tell you." The battle for Ridgefield Air Station was about to begin, and their salvation was standing at a communications console trying to contact assets that officially didn't exist to deploy countermeasures that weren't supposed to be available. The quiet woman who'd served their coffee for 8 years was about to reveal exactly what kind of guardian angel had been protecting them all along. What happened next would be remembered by every person in that communications center for the rest of their lives. Kylie de Vera moved to the primary communication console with the fluid precision of someone who'd operated such equipment under pressure countless times before. Her fingers flew across controls that she clearly knew by heart, accessing communication channels that weren't supposed to exist and entering authorization codes that should have been far beyond any civilian contractors' clearance level. "Silent Shield Command, this is Guardian Angel." She spoke into the headset with calm authority, using call signs that made Master Sergeant Chien's blood run cold. "Authentication code Omega 77 Delta. We have multiple inbound nuclear threats, estimated impact in 10 minutes. Requesting immediate activation of Contingency Protocol 7. The response came through the speakers with crystal clarity. "Guardian Angel, this is Silent Shield Command. Authentication confirmed. We show 4 500 kiloton warheads inbound to your position. Contingency Protocol 7 is authorized. Defense grid activation in 60 seconds. Colonel Blackwood stared at Kylie with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Miss de Vera, what the hell is going on here? What is Silent Shield Command?" Kylie turned to face him, and for the first time in 8 years, everyone in the room saw her without the carefully constructed mask of civilian deference. The woman looking back at them had the bearing of a senior military officer, the confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions under impossible pressure, and the cold competence that comes from years of training in the deadliest aspects of warfare. "Colonel Blackwood," she said with formal military courtesy, "my name is Lieutenant Colonel Catherine de Vera, former commanding officer of the Silent Shield Division, Nuclear Threat Assessment and Containment. For the past 8 years, I have been assigned to this facility under deep cover to monitor and protect classified defense assets that you were never briefed about because your security clearance isn't high enough." The revelation hit the room like a shockwave. Major Foster's mouth fell open in disbelief, while Staff Sergeant Kim turned to stare at the woman who'd been serving his coffee every morning with knowledge that she was one of the most highly classified military specialists in the country. But Master Sergeant Chun nodded grimly, finally understanding why his instincts had been telling him there was more to their coffee lady than met the eye. "The missiles heading toward us aren't random targets," Kylie continued. her attention divided between the communication console and the radar screen showing the approaching threats. Ridgefield Air Station is the primary monitoring facility for the Western United States nuclear detection grid. More importantly, this base houses the control systems for a network of hidden defensive installations that were built during the Cold War and updated with technology that officially doesn't exist. She gestured toward a wall panel that everyone had assumed contained electrical systems. At her touch, it slid aside to reveal a sophisticated command center that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Banks of monitors showed tactical displays, satellite feeds, and tracking data that made the base's regular communication equipment look primitive by comparison. The Silent Shield Division was created to operate and protect these systems, Kylie explained as she moved to the hidden command center and began activating systems with practiced efficiency. When the program was officially disbanded 8 years ago, a small number of specialists were placed in deep cover at key facilities to maintain readiness for exactly this kind of scenario. Through the speakers, Silent Shield Command provided updates that painted a picture of coordinated attack across multiple targets. Guardian Angel were showing simultaneous strikes against Malmstrom, Warren Air Force Base, and 3 civilian population centers. This is a full-scale nuclear assault. Defense Grid is online and tracking all targets. Kylie's hands moved across controls that seemed to respond to her touch like extensions of her own nervous system. Roger, Silent Shield. Initiating local countermeasures. All personnel in this facility need to prepare for electromagnetic pulse effects from defensive intercepts. What followed was a demonstration of military technology that none of the regular Ridgefield personnel had known existed. From hidden silos scattered across the Montana plains, interceptor missiles launched with velocities that made conventional military hardware look sluggish. Directed energy weapons that had been disguised as communication towers suddenly rotated to track incoming threats. Defensive systems that had been sleeping under prairie grass for decades came online with the devastating precision of technology. Decades ahead of anything the public knew existed, the interceptor missiles reached their targets 6 minutes before the nuclear warheads would have impacted their intended locations. The electromagnetic pulse from the defensive detonations lit up the sky with aurora-like effects and temporarily disrupted electronic systems across 3 states. But when the light faded and the systems came back online, the radar screens showed empty sky where moments before they had displayed incoming annihilation. All targets neutralized, came the confirmation from Silent Shield Command. Threat assessment shows coordinated attack from hostile foreign power using submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Secondary defensive measures remain online pending further threat evaluation. The communication center fell into stunned silence as the magnitude of what they'd just witnessed settled over everyone present. Kylie remained at the hidden command console, monitoring systems and coordinating with assets that continued to operate under classification levels that made most military secrets look like public information. Colonel Blackwood found his voice. First, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Lieutenant Colonel de Vera, we had no idea. Why weren't we informed about any of this? Kylie turned from the console to address him with the patient professionalism of a senior officer. Briefing a subordinate. Colonel, the Silent Shield Division operates under classification levels that require presidential authorization to access. Your assignment to Ridgefield was based on administrative requirements, not operational need to know. My mission was to maintain cover while ensuring that these defensive capabilities remained ready for activation. She gestured toward the sophisticated equipment that surrounded them. For 8 years, I've been maintaining these systems under the cover of routine base operations. Every morning when I arrived early, I was conducting diagnostic checks on equipment that protects hundreds of millions of American lives. Every coffee run gave me access to monitoring stations throughout the base. Every friendly conversation with personnel was actually intelligence gathering to ensure no security breaches had occurred. Major Foster, who had spent weeks humiliating her for her supposed incompetence, looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. "Ma'am, either way we treated you ... I had no idea ... Kylie's expression softened slightly, though her posture remained that of a commanding officer addressing subordinates. "Major, you were doing your job as you understood it. But now you understand why some people serve in ways that aren't immediately visible, and why it's dangerous to assume that you know everything about the people around you." Through the communication system, Silent Shield Command provided final confirmation. Guardian Angel, threat assessment complete. Attack appears to have been a limited probe of defensive capabilities, rather than full-scale assault. Recommend maintaining elevated alert status pending political resolution. Kylie acknowledged the transmission and began securing the hidden command systems, but she left the displays active so that everyone present could see the scope of the network they'd never known existed. Defensive installations scattered across the continent, monitoring stations hidden in plain sight, and weapon systems that could respond to threats faster than most people could comprehend them. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said as she removed the headset and faced the assembled personnel, "what you've seen here today remains classified at the highest levels. But I want you to understand that for 8 years, you've been serving at one of the most critical defense installations in North America, protected by systems and people that most of the world will never know exist." She looked directly at Blackwood, her expression carrying 8 years of suppressed authority. "Colonel, I believe we need to have a conversation about how this base actually operates, and what your role is in protecting assets that are considerably more important than quarterly efficiency reports." The quiet woman who'd served their coffee for 8 years had just saved the western United States from nuclear annihilation. And everyone in that room was beginning to understand that they'd been in the presence of a guardian angel who'd been protecting them all along, one perfectly maintained defensive system at a time. The debriefing that followed the nuclear crisis lasted 6 hours and fundamentally changed everything about how Ridgefield Air Station operated. Colonel Blackwood sat across from Lieutenant Colonel De Vera in what had once been his private office, but which now felt more like a classroom where he was receiving the most important education of his military career. The woman he'd dismissed as an inefficient contractor was patiently explaining defensive protocols and operational requirements that made his previous concerns about administrative efficiency seem laughably irrelevant. "Colonel," Kylie said with the professional courtesy of a senior officer briefing a subordinate, "I want you to understand that nothing you've done here has been malicious or intentionally harmful. You were assigned to Ridgefield based on administrative needs, and you've performed those duties according to your understanding of the base's mission. But that understanding was necessarily incomplete because your security clearance didn't allow access to our actual operational requirements." Blackwood struggled to process the magnitude of what he'd learned. For 3 months, he'd been implementing efficiency protocols designed to streamline what he thought was a simple support facility. In reality, he'd been interfering with defensive systems that protected hundreds of millions of lives, and he'd been harassing one of the most qualified nuclear defense specialists in the American military. "Lieutenant Colonel De Vera," he said, using her proper rank for the first time, "I owe you an apology that goes far beyond anything I can express in words. The way Major Foster and I treated you, the restrictions we placed on your access. If we had compromised your ability to respond to today's threat, ... double quotes." Kylie held up a hand to stop him. "Colonel, the defensive systems worked exactly as designed. My cover remained intact until the moment it needed to be broken. In many ways, your administrative oversight actually helped maintain the illusion that this was just another forgotten military outpost. Our enemies clearly believed they were striking an undefended target. The revelation that their harassment had inadvertently contributed to operational security was small comfort to Blackwood, who was beginning to understand the scope of his ignorance. "What happens now? Do you resume your cover, or—" "My deep cover assignment ended the moment I activated the silent shield protocols," Kylie replied. "From this point forward, Ridgefield Air Station will operate under its true mission parameters. You'll receive new briefings, updated security clearances, and operational guidelines that reflect our actual defensive responsibilities." She gestured toward the hidden command center that was now visible through the opened wall panel. "This facility is the primary coordination point for the Western United States Nuclear Defense Network. The personnel stationed here aren't just support staff. They're the guardians of systems that most people will never know exist. That includes you, Colonel. Your role is about to become considerably more complex and infinitely more important." The conversation was interrupted by Master Sergeant Chun, who entered with a folder containing updated personnel files and security documentation. "Colonel, Lieutenant Colonel De Vera, I have the revised organizational structure from Silent Shield Command. It's quite different from what we've been operating under." The new organizational chart revealed that Ridgefield Air Station was actually a major installation with responsibilities that extended across 3 time zones. What they'd thought was a skeleton crew of 247 personnel was actually a carefully selected team of specialists, many of whom had been operating under their own forms of cover. The communications technicians were actually signals intelligence experts. The maintenance personnel were specialists in highly classified defensive systems. Even the security guards had backgrounds in counterintelligence operations. 8 years, Blackwood said quietly, reviewing the files with growing amazement. "You've all been maintaining this deception for 8 years. Not deception," Kylie corrected gently. "Operational security. Every person on this base has been serving their country at the highest levels, but in ways that required absolute secrecy. Today's attack proves that the mission remains as critical as ever." Major Foster, who had been conspicuously absent from the initial debriefing, finally appeared in the doorway with an expression of profound humiliation. He'd spent the morning reviewing his own actions over the past 3 months and coming to terms with the fact that he'd been systematically harassing someone whose little finger contained more military expertise than he'd accumulated in his entire career. "Lieutenant Colonel De Vera," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know how to begin to apologize for my behavior. The way I treated you, the things I said... if I had known." Kylie studied him with the same patient expression she'd maintained throughout 8 years of enduring his petty authority. "Major Foster, you were operating based on the information available to you. But I hope today has taught you something about the danger of making assumptions about people whose backgrounds you don't fully understand." Foster nodded miserably. "Ma'am, it has. I'd like to request a transfer if that's possible. I don't think I'm qualified to serve at a facility of this importance." "Transfer denied," Kylie said with quiet authority. "Major, you're going to stay right here and learn how to be the kind of officer that a facility like this requires. You have administrative skills that we need, but you're going to apply them in service of our actual mission rather than arbitrary efficiency metrics." The transformation of relationships throughout Ridgefield Air Station continued over the following days as personnel adjusted to new realities and revised understanding of their roles. Staff Sergeant Kim, who discovered that his communications expertise had been carefully selected for its relevance to nuclear defense protocols, threw himself into learning the advanced systems he'd been working alongside without knowing their true purpose. Sergeant Martinez and the other enlisted personnel found themselves recipients of security briefings and training programs that revealed the true scope of their responsibilities. The casual atmosphere that had characterized relationships between military and civilian personnel was replaced by professional respect, based on mutual understanding of shared mission requirements. But perhaps the most significant change was in how everyone viewed Kylie herself. The woman they'd called the Coffee Lady was now recognized as Lieutenant Colonel de Vera, commanding officer of defensive systems that represented the most advanced military technology on Earth. Yet she continued to arrive early each morning, continued to ensure that everyone was properly fed, and continued to maintain the personal relationships that had made her popular with the troops. "It's strange," Corporal Thompson confided to his colleagues during lunch a week after the crisis. "She's still the same person who remembers how I like my coffee and asks about my wedding plans. But now I know she's also someone who can stop nuclear missiles and coordinate with assets that officially don't exist." The observation captured something essential about Kylie's character that transcended military rank or classified responsibilities. Whether she was serving coffee or saving the continent from nuclear annihilation, she approached her duties with the same fundamental commitment to protecting and caring for the people around her. Colonel Blackwood, now operating with full knowledge of Ridgefield's actual mission, found himself working alongside someone whose expertise dwarfed his own in every area that mattered. But rather than feeling diminished, he discovered that supporting truly important work was more fulfilling than managing arbitrary administrative processes. "Lieutenant Colonel," he said during one of their daily briefings, "I want you to know that this has been the most educational experience of my military career. I thought I understood leadership and military efficiency. You've shown me what those concepts actually mean when lives depend on getting them right." Kylie smiled with genuine warmth. "Colonel, the best leaders are the ones who can adapt when they discover new information. You've done exactly that, and this facility is stronger because of your willingness to learn." As Ridgefield Air Station settled into its new operational rhythm, one thing became clear to everyone involved. They had been serving alongside a guardian angel for 8 years, someone who'd protected them not just from external threats, from their own ignorance of how important their work actually was. The Coffee Lady had taught them all a lesson about service, sacrifice, and the quiet heroism of people who protect others without seeking recognition or reward. 6 months after the nuclear crisis that changed everything at Ridgefield Air Station, the base had settled into a new rhythm that reflected both its true mission and the lessons learned from 8 years of hidden guardianship. The morning routine still began at 05:00 hours, but now it started with Lieutenant Colonel Catherine de Vera conducting security briefings alongside her traditional breakfast service, seamlessly blending the nurturing care that had made her beloved. As a civilian contractor with the professional expertise that made her indispensable as a military commander, the transformation had been more profound than anyone could have anticipated. What had once been a forgotten outpost operating under the illusion of administrative routine was now recognized as one of the most critical defense installations in North America. Personnel who'd thought they were serving out quiet assignments at a backwater facility discovered they were actually manning the front lines of nuclear defense, responsible for systems that could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. For millions of people, Colonel Blackwood had embraced his revised role with the enthusiasm of someone who'd finally found work that mattered. His administrative skills, which had seemed obsessively bureaucratic when applied to fictional efficiency metrics, proved invaluable when directed towards supporting genuine operational requirements. The same attention to detail that had made him a nightmare for civilian contractors now ensured that critical defense systems received the resources and oversight they needed to maintain peak readiness. "It's remarkable," he confided to General Sarah Mitchell during her quarterly inspection visit. "I spent my entire career thinking I understood military leadership, but I was just moving papers around. Working with Lieutenant Colonel de Vera has shown me what command actually means when you're responsible for protecting something that really matters." General Mitchell, who had been Kylie's commanding officer during her official military service years earlier, smiled as she watched her former subordinate conducting a training exercise with personnel who hung on her every word. Catherine always had a gift for bringing out the best in people around her. But I think her years undercover taught her things about leadership that no formal training could provide. The daily operations at Ridgefield reflected this new understanding of shared purpose and mutual respect. Major Foster, who had been offered transfers to less demanding assignments, chose to remain and rebuild his relationship with personnel he'd previously dismissed. His transformation from petty tyrant to supportive administrator became a model for how people could grow when they understood the true stakes of their work. "I used to think that authority meant making people follow rules," Foster explained to newly arrived personnel during orientation briefings. "Lieutenant Colonel De Vera taught me that real leadership means helping people understand why those rules matter. When you're protecting millions of lives, compliance isn't about bureaucracy. It's about love of country and commitment to something bigger than yourself." The enlisted personnel had undergone their own transformation as they learned the true scope of their responsibilities. Staff Sergeant Kim, now fully briefed on the communication systems he'd been maintaining, approached his duties with the intensity of someone who understood that a moment of inattention could have catastrophic consequences. Sergeant Martinez and Corporal Thompson found themselves studying advanced technical manuals and attending classified training sessions that revealed capabilities they'd never imagined. But perhaps the most significant change was in how everyone viewed service itself. The revelation that their coffee lady had been protecting them for 8 years while asking for nothing in return had fundamentally altered their understanding of what it meant to serve their country. They began to see their own duties not as obligations to be endured, but as opportunities to contribute to something essential and sacred. Kylie's integration of her dual roles as commanding officer and community caretaker became the defining characteristic of Ridgefield's new culture. She still arrived early to ensure breakfast service ran smoothly, still remembered everyone's preferences and personal concerns, still took time to ask about families and offer encouragement during difficult times. But now these interactions carried the additional weight of a commanding officer who genuinely cared about the welfare of the people under her command. "She's still the same person who remembers that I take cream in my afternoon coffee and asks about my daughter's softball games," Airman Michelle Davis observed during a break in advanced training exercises. "But now I also know she's someone who coordinates with assets that can stop nuclear wars." It makes you realize that the most important people are often the ones who seem most ordinary. The base's relationship with the surrounding community had also evolved in subtle but meaningful ways. While the full scope of Ridgefield's mission remained classified, local residents in Cedar Falls began to notice changes that suggested their quiet military neighbors were involved in more important work than anyone had realized. Increased security measures, more frequent visits from high-ranking officials, and the obvious pride that base personnel took in their assignments all contributed to a growing awareness that something significant was happening at the facility. They'd taken for granted Kylie's modest apartment in Cedar Falls remained her refuge from the intense responsibilities of command, but even her civilian routines reflected the integration of her dual identity. Her small garden, which had always been meticulously maintained, now included vegetables chosen for their nutritional value during extended emergency operations. Her home office, previously empty except for a desk and a few personal items, now contained secure communication equipment that allowed her to monitor global threat assessments from anywhere. The most telling change was in her relationship with the photograph she'd kept hidden for 8 years, the image of her original Silent Shield Division team that had been presumed lost during their classified mission. The picture now sat openly on her desk in the command center, no longer a painful reminder of a past she couldn't acknowledge, but a proud declaration of service that had never actually ended. When new personnel arrived at Ridgefield, they received briefings that included Kylie's story as an example of the dedication and sacrifice that characterized service at the facility. The tale of the coffee lady who'd protected them for 8 years, while maintaining perfect operational security, became a legend that captured everything the base stood for: quiet professionalism, unwavering commitment, and the understanding that the most important victories are often achieved by people whose names never appear in history books. Lieutenant Colonel De Vera represents the best of what we aspire to be. Colonel Blackwood would tell new arrivals during their initial orientation. She shows us that true heroism isn't about glory or recognition. It's about showing up every day, doing the work that needs to be done, and being ready when your country needs you most. The coffee service at Ridgefield Air Station continued, as it had for 8 years, but now it carried additional meaning. Every morning, as personnel gathered for breakfast and mission briefings, they were reminded that the woman serving their coffee was also the guardian angel who'd been protecting them all along. And in that daily ritual of shared meals and mutual care, they found a perfect metaphor for service itself, nourishing others while staying ready to defend what matters most. The base had found its new equilibrium, one that honored both the hidden sacrifice of the past and the revealed purpose of the present. And at the center of it all was Kylie De Vera, who had taught them that the greatest strength often comes disguised as ordinary kindness, and that the most important battles are fought by people who serve not for glory, but for love. 2 years have passed since the morning when nuclear missiles streaked through the Montana sky toward targets that would have changed the course of human history. The crisis lasted less than 20 minutes from detection to resolution, but its impact on everyone who lived through it continues to resonate in ways both profound and subtle. At Ridgefield Air Station, now operating under its true designation as the Western Regional Nuclear Defense Coordination Center, the lessons learned from 8 years of hidden guardianship have become the foundation for a new understanding of what military service actually means. Lieutenant Colonel Catherine De Vera still arrives at the base every morning at 0500 hours, though now she drives through gates where guards snap to attention with genuine respect rather than casual indifference. Her routine still includes ensuring that everyone receives proper nutrition and care, but it also encompasses coordination with defense networks that span continents and protection of assets that most world leaders don't know exist. The integration of these responsibilities has created something unique in modern military service, a command structure built on the understanding that protecting people requires both advanced technology and fundamental human compassion. The story of the coffee lady has spread far beyond Ridgefield Air Station, becoming a legend within the classified circles of America's defense establishment. Senior military officers use Kylie's example when training personnel about the importance of operational security and the danger of making assumptions about the people around them. Intelligence agencies study her 8-year deep cover operation as a masterclass in maintaining identity while serving mission requirements. Most importantly, her story has become a reminder that the most critical work is often done by people whose contributions remain invisible until the moment they become essential. What Lieutenant Colonel De Vera accomplished goes beyond successful mission completion, explains General Patricia Hawkins, now commander of the Strategic Defense Initiative, during classified briefings at the Pentagon. She demonstrated that true readiness isn't just about having the right equipment or the correct protocols. It's about having people who understand that service is a calling, not a job, and who are willing to sacrifice recognition for the sake of protecting others. The broader implications of Kylie's story extend far beyond military applications. In corporate boardrooms and community organizations, leaders have begun to recognize that their most valuable assets might be the quiet, reliable people they've been taking for granted. The phenomenon has been dubbed the De Vera effect, the understanding that exceptional capability often disguises itself as ordinary competence, and that dismissing people based on superficial assessments can blind organizations to their greatest strengths. At Ridgefield itself, the culture that emerged from the revelation continues to evolve and deepen. New personnel arriving at the facility undergo orientation programs that emphasize both technical excellence and personal care. For colleagues, the base has become a model for military installations worldwide, demonstrating how operational effectiveness increases when people understand that their work serves something larger than bureaucratic requirements. Colonel Blackwood, now fully integrated into his role as administrative commander of a critical defense facility, has become an advocate for leadership approaches that prioritize substance over appearance. His quarterly reports to regional command consistently emphasize the lessons learned from working alongside someone whose true qualifications were hidden for nearly a decade. "The most important thing I've learned," he wrote in a recent evaluation, "is that competence and dedication don't always announce themselves with fanfare. Some of our most valuable people are the ones who show up every day, do their jobs with quiet excellence, and ask for nothing more than the opportunity to serve." Our responsibility as leaders is to recognize and support that service, not to create barriers that prevent good people from doing important work. Major Foster's transformation has been particularly remarkable. The officer who once took pleasure in harassing civilian contractors has become a passionate advocate for treating all personnel with dignity and respect. His training programs for newly assigned officers focus heavily on the danger of assuming that rank or position correlates with importance or capability. "I learned the hard way that the person you're dismissing as unimportant might be the person who saves your life," Foster tells new arrivals with the conviction of someone who's lived through the consequences of his own arrogance. "Lieutenant Colonel De Vera taught me that real strength often looks like service, and that the most dangerous enemies are the assumptions we make about people we don't really know." The enlisted personnel who serve alongside Kylie have developed their own understanding of what her example means for their careers and their lives. They've learned that excellence isn't about seeking recognition, but about finding ways to contribute meaningfully to something larger than themselves. The culture at Ridgefield now reflects this understanding, with personnel taking pride not in individual achievement, but in collective mission success. Staff Sergeant Kim, now one of the most qualified communications specialists in the nuclear defense network, credits Kylie's example with teaching him about the difference between being noticed and being valuable. "She showed us that the most important work happens when nobody's watching," he explains to younger airmen during mentoring sessions. "When you focus on doing the right thing instead of getting credit for doing the right thing, you become the kind of person that others can depend on." The ripple effects of Kylie's story continue to spread through communities far from Montana. Military families share her example with children who struggle to understand why their parents' work is important, even when it can't be discussed. Teachers use her story to help students understand that heroism comes in many forms, and that the most significant contributions are often made by people whose names never appear in textbooks. Perhaps most importantly, Kylie's story has become a reminder that in an age of global threats and technological complexity, human character remains the most critical defense asset. Advanced weapon systems and sophisticated protocols are essential, but they're ultimately only as effective as the people who operate them. The 8 years that Kylie spent serving coffee while protecting nuclear defense systems demonstrated that the most powerful technology in the world is meaningless without individuals who are willing to dedicate their lives to using it responsibly. As she continues her dual role as commanding officer and community caretaker, Kylie De Vera represents something that transcends military rank or technical expertise. She embodies the understanding that true security comes not from the weapons we build or the walls we construct, but from the commitment of people who choose to serve others without seeking reward or recognition. Every morning at Ridgefield Air Station, as personnel gather for breakfast and mission briefings, they're reminded that their coffee is being served by someone who saved the western United States from nuclear annihilation. But more importantly, they're reminded that she did it not for glory or advancement, but because she understood that some things are worth protecting, regardless of whether anyone notices the protection. In a world where heroism is often associated with dramatic gestures and public recognition, Kylie DeVera's story offers a different model: the quiet guardian who serves in shadows, the professional who finds purpose in protecting others, and the leader who understands that the most important victories are achieved by people whose names never appear in history books. The coffee lady of Ridgefield Air Station taught everyone around her that the greatest strength often comes disguised as ordinary service, and that the most important battles are fought by people who show up every day, do the work that needs to be done, and stand ready to give everything when their country calls. In an uncertain world, that lesson remains as relevant and as powerful as the day it was first learned. Her story continues, not as a concluded narrative, but as an ongoing example of what's possible when people choose service over recognition, substance over appearance, and love of country over love of self. And somewhere in Montana, in a facility that most people will never know exists, a guardian angel continues to serve coffee while protecting the world. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.